Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our webinar is beginning. I'm Steve Love, President and CEO of the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council. We want to thank you for taking time today for this very timely and educational webinar. And it's hosted in coordination with Hall Renda, who is an associate member and a longtime friend and supporter of the DFW Hospital Council. Our topic today, on the Hill, legislative and regulatory developments you need to know. And we were just chatting. These change hourly almost, so really pay attention. It's going to be an excellent presentation. We've got two excellent speakers from Hall Renda from Washington, D.C., and they are both attorneys with Hall Renda, John Williams III and Abigail, who will go by Abby Kaericher. John is a former press secretary for the House Committee on Government Reform and Oversight. He also served as the chairman's advisor on domestic policy matters, including healthcare, Social Security reform, and transportation. Abby has served as the Associate General Counsel and Vice President of the legislation at the Federation of American Hospitals, which represents over 1,000 investor-owned hospitals on Capitol Hill in the administration. I think most of y'all know Chip Kahn, who leads that organization. These two national experts are going to detail some of the latest legislative changes, and they're going to go out and do predictions on what's going to happen in the future. Isn't that great? I do want to say, if you have any questions, please type them into either the question box or the chat, and after their presentations, we're going to try to answer your questions. So without further ado, it's my privilege to introduce John Williams III.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to see y'all. Nice to be with y'all. I was a little hesitant on the title and the word no, because I'm not sure anybody knows what's happening right now. And that includes the folks that are actually responsible for putting together the legislation that everybody's trying to track right now. But we'll do the best we can and dive into it. Abby, you want to go ahead and move forward on the first one?
We are trying to move ahead. There we go.
We go. So, the disclaimer, we're, of course, attorneys, so we get to do the disclaimer portion of the presentation. Go ahead, Ab. The next one. We will be doing a lot of crystal ball type of discussion here. Those of you who have spent time in Washington know that everybody in that town loves to think or believe that they know what's happening, when there's really only a handful of people who can say that they truly know what's happening at any given point in time. So we are going to try to do the best we can to kind of game out where a lot of the things that everybody's interested in might be going. Next one there, Abby. I always use this slide and this comment from President Obama, because you cannot separate politics from policy in Washington, D.C. I've got law partners. We've done a lot of work at Hall Renda on stark reform legislation over the years, and Abby and I are by no means experts in the Stark law, but we have a number of attorneys at Hall Renda who actually wrote the original legislation, and I say original legislation for the last Stark law exception that was passed, because when we got the final version back from the committee informing us that this is what we're going to go with, it was not what we had originally given them, and my law partner Brian said to me, well, why this? And I said, well, this is what it is. And he said, well, but it's not perfect. Why wouldn't they want it to be perfect? And he said, we don't work in the world of perfect. We work in the world of what's possible. And that's always important to remember when you're dealing with Capitol Hill, right? Because you are constrained by politics. on the Hill in terms of what you can accomplish, especially when you have a very small majority like Republicans do in the House right now. We move on, Abby. So I'm going to talk about Capitol Hill. Abby's going to talk a bit about the administration and some things that are going on over there. So to dive into it, go ahead, Abby. So this Congress started with two really overarching issues. How are they going to fund the government for the fiscal year 25? And how are Republicans going to go about using the budget reconciliation process to pass President Trump's legislative agenda? And we'll move to the next one. So, starting off with government funding, you may recall that last December Congress passed a continuing resolution, which, for those of you who don't know, it's a legislative vehicle that they use to pass spending bills when they can't do it the old-fashioned schoolhouse rock way, as I say. And they used it to fund the government through March of this year. Interesting, the first version of the continuing resolution that came out last December actually had about a little over 550 pages of healthcare policy provisions in it. They were really trying to clear the decks at the end of the last Congress and get a lot of things reauthorized and other policy priorities from both parties passed. Well, thanks to Elon, almost all of those were stripped from the CR. For those of you who followed it, you may recall, and if you're smart enough to not spend as much time on Twitter or X or whatever we're calling it these days, Elon posted, tweeted, whatever, out a picture after the whole thing was over, and it was this original copy of the CR, which was a stack of papers, and then what was eventually passed, and it was a very small stack of papers, and he had been so outraged that Congress was going to do this great big CR. Well, the dirty little secret was that the very small package spent as much money as the great big package. But in Washington, why would you ever let the truth get in the way of a really good narrative? So most of that stuff was stripped. Those listed here you see on the slide, the moratorium on the ACA-related Medicaid dish cuts, extension of the telehealth and the hospital home waivers, extension of the Medicare dependent hospital program, low volume hospital adjustment. All these are ones that made it into the CR because they are the same ones that rode or were attached to the two prior CRs. So they were non-controversial, if you will. They'd happened before, so they let them happen again. Now they have until September 30th of this year to try to figure out what they're going to do. And to switch to crystal ball mode, they say they're going to appropriate this year, but I don't know anyone that truly believes them in the current atmosphere. I think our guess is that when September rolls around, we're going to end up with another continuing resolution that runs into December, when they'll talk about doing another one of these things that we call the Christmas tree omnibus, which is where all the appropriations bills that they couldn't pass are combined into one big massive bill. It's 2,000 pages long. They're gonna try to do that. They're going to talk about doing that, but that's going to be a heavy lift. And I think that they're probably going to do another CR even in December, because there's going to be so much bad blood after reconciliation that it's hard to see there being enough goodwill around to get a deal done. But I will say this for the first time, and it won't be the last time probably on this presentation. I have been wrong many times before. And I could be wrong because, to steal more cliches, and Abby knows I'm full of them, December is a lifetime away in politics. So, Abby, thank you. I thought this was an interesting slide. Talk about the schoolhouse rock and the traditional way, old school way of doing things. These continuing resolutions have really become the norm in DC. I found it fascinating that they haven't funded the federal government. They haven't passed all 12 appropriations bills before September 30th, since I was a 20-something-year-old staffer working on a Hill. And I'm 55 now. It's been a long time. since they've done that. And they just come to rely on them more and more and more because it's really hard to get stuff done on a bipartisan basis. Moving next. So, budget reconciliation. I could do an entire presentation on how the budget reconciliation process works. But I think what you need to know for the purposes of the process at this point are that reconciliation really allows Congress to do two things. It allows legislation to be passed without having to get 60 votes in the Senate. And the other important thing to know about it is that provisions in the reconciliation bill must have some impact on the federal treasury. You are not supposed to do routine policy changes through the budget reconciliation process. And this is what is known as the Byrd Rule in the Senate. And a parliamentarian over there gets to decide what meets the Byrd Rule, what doesn't meet the Byrd Rule. And we've had a lot of clients ask us who have policy change priorities, can we get this into reconciliation? And we've talked about it with folks. The answer we always get is no. That's not going to pass the Byrd Rule, the Byrd path, as they call it. So those are the two ones that you really need to pay attention to, or you really kind of need to know in terms of what's possible through the reconciliation process. Next one. I thought this was interesting. It really has become common. 23 bills since 1980. It's really common. In fact, it only happens whenever one party controls the House, the Senate, and the White House. That's what you got to have line up in order to do budget reconciliation. So it's not unprecedented. The Democrats have used it to pass the Affordable Care Act. They used it for the Inflation Reduction Act, and Republicans have historically used it to pass, large tax cut packages. So we are not in uncharted territory by any means with this process. So the part that y'all are probably interested in, and I don't want to go too far down in the weeds on the budget reconciliation process, but there are basically 3 steps to it. You got to pass a resolution, you got to write a bill, and then you got to get the bill passed. So this time around, Republicans first had to decide whether to do one bill with everything in it, or to split it into 2 bills where the easier stuff goes first and the harder stuff goes second. Senate Republicans wanted to do 2 bills. House Republicans wanted the one big, beautiful bill that the president has talked about, mostly because they have a very small majority. And because Speaker Johnson didn't think that he could get 2 bills like this through the House in the same year. The House Republicans eventually won out in that discussion and debate when President Trump endorsed the one big, beautiful bill approach. So earlier this month, the House started the actual process by passing a resolution that gave instructions to the committees that are responsible for then writing their portions of the bill on subjects for which those committees have jurisdiction. So you'll see here, overall, the House resolution requires at least $1.5 trillion in spending cuts with a goal of $2 trillion in spending cuts. So each committee has to meet certain targets to make that possible, and I will get into more of that here in a minute. The resolution narrowly passed the House. It went to the Senate. This was earlier, I guess we're still in April, so earlier this month, where that chamber amended the resolution to require, and I hate to use the word only, but only $4 billion in spending cuts. Republican Majority Leader John Thune pledged to seek more money in cuts, but that was not in their version of the resolution. So that was passed through the Senate, and it was sent back to the House on what was basically a take it or leave it basis. This is where I thought things would really sort of begin to bog down. But the House took it, and they passed it right before the Easter recess started a little over 2 weeks ago. And so I have to give Speaker Johnson some credit for getting that through the House with a really, really small majority. But I want to be clear that passing the resolution is supposed to be the easy part. And for those of you who follow this process closely, it was anything but easy. And so, they're still really just kind of getting started. I mean, I grew up in Galveston. I played football all high school. So I understand, how everybody in Texas feels about football. So to use a football analogy, they just moved the chains to their own 20-yard line. And so they have a long way to go here. And now they're really on step 2 that you can see, they're in the right-hand column. And this is the part where the House committees are going to have to write their portion of the actual bill. They're going to have to pass it through their committees, and then they're going to send it or report it to the House Budget Committee. And then the House Budget Committee is going to put all of those things together into one big, beautiful bill. So once that's done, then it goes to the House floor for a vote. Assuming it can pass the House, it will then go to the Senate, where the process will almost certainly slow down. The Senate doesn't do much of anything very quickly. And then you have a lot of moderate senators, think Susan Collins from Maine, or Lisa Murkowski from Alaska, or Mitch McConnell from Kentucky, who nobody would ever say is moderate, but just can't stand Donald Trump and does everything he can to poke his finger in his eye before he leaves. They are going to make sure that process slows down, and especially when it comes to issues like Medicaid, which I'll get more into in a second. So once the Senate gets it, they're going to essentially go through the same process, and their committees have been instructed to come up with certain savings. For example, the Senate Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions Committee has been tasked with coming up with $1 billion in savings. So they have some work to do over there. Once that happens, excuse me, those committees will report their respective bills to the Senate Budget Committee, where Lindsey Graham, who chairs that committee, will be responsible for putting all of those together. Then it goes to the Senate floor, where the Senate will engage in this process they call a vote-a-rama. And that is where an unlimited number of amendments can be offered by either party. And this is where Democrats can really try to squeeze Republicans, especially the leadership, by offering amendments that are difficult for moderates to vote against. Assuming that the bill gets through the vote-a-rama without any types of poison pills being attached to it that would require something as drastic as the leadership, pulling the bill from the floor before a vote, it would go to a final vote in the Senate, where it would only have to pass with a simple majority. So again, not the 60 as you would typically have under normal legislative circumstances. So then it's going to go back to the House on what we can expect to be a take it or leave it basis, much like the resolution. And there are a lot of conservative Republicans in the House, Chip Roy from Texas being a perfect example of one, who went along with the resolution against their ideological druthers, if you will, with the understanding that they were going to, save their ammo and fight for another day, and that day being when either one, what the House passes, or as a last stand. And I'm gonna keep using Texas analogies, right? Like we're at the Alamo now or whatever, and Chip Roy is gonna try to stop whatever comes from the Senate. And that's where Trump's going to have to step in and really do whatever it is that he does that keeps all these people on board. So the House could also change it and send it back to the Senate. And we start this process of going back and forth across Capitol Hill. That's a possibility. It's really hard to say how realistic that is at this point. If it gets through the House, then it goes to the president to be signed. And I know it says on the slide here that the House committees have been directed to submit their portions of the bill by May 9th, which is next week. There's nothing that says that they have to. I don't think the Ways and Means Committee is going to be ready by May 9th anyway. That said, Speaker Johnson has pledged to have a bill passed out of the House before Memorial Day recess on May 23rd. That's kind of interesting because before the Easter recess, Speaker Johnson was telling everybody that they were going to have a bill on President Trump's desk by the Memorial Day recess. And they conveniently come back from the Easter recess, and that has now switched to, no, we're going to have a bill out of the House by Memorial Day. According to what was reported out earlier this week, or I believe it was earlier this week, there was a meeting at the White House, amongst Republican leadership. And when they came out of that, the plan is now to have a bill on Trump's desk by the 4th of July. And I believe Senator Thune referred to that as to being their aspiration. And even that may be optimistic, depending on how things go. So, moving on to the next slide, the $1 million question that I'm sure everybody on this webinar would like to know: what healthcare spending cuts are they going to use to meet their savings target? I don't think they 100% know at this point. In fact, I'm pretty sure of it. Abby was with Chairman Guthrie, the chairman of the Energy and Commerce Committee, last weekend, and he was very non-committal. I think, Abby, that's fair to say, about what they're going to do. We do know what they are considering, and Energy and Commerce has been tasked with finding $880 billion in savings, and that's a pretty big number. ENC has a jurisdiction over an awful lot of things. It's got jurisdiction over telecom. It's got jurisdiction over energy. But nobody believes, especially the people that matter on the committee, that they can find $880 billion in savings without going to Medicaid, which they also have jurisdiction over. And so the list that you see here is are the things that we have been told by staff on the committee or members of the committee are under consideration. And for those of you who do government relations, I don't think this is going to be really news to you. The three that we heard over and over again are, a layup, or whatever you want to call it, if you will, are work requirements, doing redeterminations more frequently, eligibility, so preventing those in the country illegally from getting Medicaid benefits. Those are the three that we've heard from just about everybody on the Republican side is, those are a done deal. Those are a done deal. Now, they're a done deal until they're not a done deal, but that's what we've been told. But that doesn't get you to $880 billion. So then you got to look at the things that do. And the three things that keep coming up over and over again are changes in the FMAP, especially as it pertains to the ACA expansion population, per capita caps, and provider taxes. So, in looking at the FMAP, Brett Guthrie, the Energy and Commerce Chairman, and Buddy Carter, the Health Subcommittee Chairman, a lot of people on the Energy and Commerce Committee, Republicans, have adopted this talking point that comes from an organization called the Paragon Health Institute, which some of you may be familiar with, about why is it that a healthy, able-bodied adult, right, part of the ACA expansion population, right, why is there 90% reimbursement for them, and some poor disabled kid is only getting, around 60% under traditional Medicaid? And why is that fair? And so they keep coming back and back and back to that again. Now, the problem that they run into with that is this pledge, right, that President Trump has made. They are not going to cut benefits. And this is where we start to play the semantic game. We're not going to cut benefits for those on Medicaid. And it is very easy. And I know they may be doing it in Texas. They're doing it in a lot of states around the country where they are running commercials. Folks who oppose cutting Medicaid saying that doing this is going to violate President Trump's pledge to not cut Medicaid. And so that's going to be a really difficult one for them to try to navigate. Per capita caps is essentially the same thing. We're gonna limit Medicaid based upon how many folks in your state that you have on Medicaid. How you paint that as not being a cut to benefits, I don't know. But we're hearing, especially in the last 24, 48 hours, that these things are still on the table. That Guthrie said everything's still on the table. Everything's still on the table right now. And they've been doing meetings with members of the committee, trying to take everybody's temperature on what they can tolerate and what they can't. But on the last one with provider taxes, and you want to talk about semantics and that type of thing, they have said over and over and over again they're going to target waste, fraud, and abuse, with a specific focus on the word abuse and what constitutes abuse. And they have said, and this again comes from the Paragon Group, they have been hammering this for years, that the way states go about using hospital provider taxes and other healthcare taxes, healthcare provider taxes, as a way to draw down additional Medicaid dollars from the federal government is an abuse of the system. In their minds, that is not the way the system was designed. It was supposed to be a defined partnership between the federal government and the states, and the way states are going about doing this. And of course, they single out a lot of blue states like California and New York with abusing the system this way. So by going with provider taxes, they are fitting within that window of we're not cutting Medicaid benefits, because this is something that the states and the providers are doing. This is not something that that's going to impact directly to beneficiaries. So that's sort of been our guess, and I'll be completely clear that it's a guess. But provider taxes really do fit neatly within this framework that they've created themselves of waste, fraud, and abuse. And Trump can easily go out and say, Gavin Newsom and California has been abusing the Medicaid system, and providing the last administration gave them a waiver that allows them to increase provider taxes to provide Medicaid benefits to people in the country illegally. So again, kind of fits neatly in there. On the other side of the slide, on the Medicare side, Abby and I kind of have a little bit of a debate over this one, on-site neutral payment reform. The reason that I put it up here is because it too fits nicely for them into this box of what is abuse. And again, for those of you who follow stuff closely, that especially over the last, the prior Congress, over the last year or two, there's been significant amount of bipartisan support for eliminating the grandfather status for hospital outpatient departments, off-campus clinics, and it does give them a decent chunk of change to come back and use to go after. So those are the things that we hear are really on the table, with the site neutral payment one being kind of my own. Abby, I'll tell you, we don't hear much about that, but to the next slide, Abby, for timeline, you can see historically it's taken a fairly long time to get a reconciliation bill to the president's desk. It's not something they can do overnight. So July 4th is certainly possible, but it is going to be tough. This thing could completely go off the rails at any point in the process. Moving to the next one there, Abby. On the debt ceiling, I added this one here because Republicans in the House and Senate have both pledged to address this in the budget reconciliation package. Conservative Republicans, again, especially those in the House, they hate lifting the debt limit. And even though it's technically for money that's already been spent, they hate it. But as you can see from the fact that 38 of them in the House defied Trump last December. Trump wanted this thing dealt with before he got to the White House in January. He wanted it taken off the table last December, and 38 House Republicans voted against it. Whether they would do that again, whether they would use that to bring down reconciliation, I don't know. But the leadership definitely wants to deal with this now, because if they deal with it separately, then they're going to have to cut a deal with Democrats because it's going to need 60 votes in the Senate to get through. And the next one there, Abby. So get a lot of questions about what else Congress might do in terms of healthcare policy changes this year. We get a lot of questions about the enhanced ACA tax credits that are set to expire at the end of this year. I have been convinced for quite some time that there isn't any way that Republicans are going to do anything to try to save or help the Affordable Care Act, especially if it costs that much money. But Abby has heard otherwise. And if there is some outside chance of a bipartisan healthcare policy package coming together to address many of those issues that were stripped out of the CR last December, then this is one that certainly could be in that, if they can find a way to pay for it. Addressing the cut to the Medicare physician payments that was in the last physician fee schedule and PBM reforms, these are a high priority for members of both parties. There's legislation that's already been introduced to deal with this stuff. Buddy Carter, who is again the health subcommittee chairman at Energy and Commerce, he told me earlier this month, that Johnson has promised him that dealing with Medicare physician payments and PBM reforms will both be in the reconciliation bill. Now, we'll just have to wait and see if that is indeed the case. Drug pricing, that's one that has bipartisan support. There could be some movement on that. Lastly, 340B reform. That is a priority for Dr. Bill Cassidy, who is the chairman of the Senate Health, Education, Labor and Pensions Committee. Protecting 340B is also a priority of Senate Majority Leader John Thune. So many of you saw that last week Cassidy released a report on 340B. Hall Render has a 340B collaborative. We do a lot of legal work in that space. We do a lot of lobbying. We were very involved. I say we. Todd Nova, who is our resident 340B expert at Hall Render, not Abby myself. Todd became an outside subject matter expert for what was known as the Gang of Six staff in the Senate that were drafting the sustained 340B Act in the last Congress. That did not get introduced. Politics sort of tanked that at the last minute in December. There are new members of the G6. And so we are told that they are going to reintroduce that. There probably will be some tweaks. Cassidy has told me that the Sustain Act would probably take precedence. They would use that as the foundation for anything that he would want to do, since it has bipartisan support. And Dr. Bill certainly likes to be bipartisan. So if he can at all. So look for some movement on the Sustain Act here in the next couple of months. But right now, it's all reconciliation all day, all night, every day of the week. So Abby, with that, I will kick it over to you.
Thank you so much, John. And thanks everyone for being here. Normally the regulatory portion of the presentation is obviously the boring part. John likes to be the exciting guy of our duo, but in today's environment, I think it's safe to say that there's enough going on that it's boring probably isn't the best word to describe our day-to-day regulatory environment here in DC. A lot of this goes without saying, but I wanted to just kind of touch on some of the main administration priorities. And we actually just celebrated Trump's 100th day in office. And whether you like him or not, it feels like we are in day 1,000. There's many reasons for this, but one could potentially be that President Trump set a record for the most executive orders and actions ever issued in his first 100 days. He did a lot more than his predecessors, and he is clocking in at more than 140 executive orders and 70 other executive actions. So it has been busy from day one with this new administration. And again, a lot of this is so covered in the news, and it's stuff that you guys are probably tired of hearing about because it's so frequently covered. But this is really like these main things have taken a lot of precedent into what President Trump's administration has done. As we've seen from day one, reforming the federal government as a workplace has obviously been a top priority for this administration. It's funny, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, has actually become a verb in DC, that things are getting doged all the time. But this has obviously created a lot of chaos and kind of set the stage for how this administration is doing business here. Elon Musk is one that has become the poster child for this. And actually, Elon Musk, as of late, has taken his foot off the gas a lot more than when he first started leading this DOGE initiative. Originally, he stated that he was planning on slashing $2 trillion from the federal budget through the DOGE initiatives. But just recently, he stated that they're not likely to get anywhere close to there. So it's a little less bullish from DOGE Captain Elon Musk. In a little bit, we are going to talk about how this is severely impacting healthcare operations as we know in DC. So I'll get to that in just a little bit. The dismantling of diversity and inclusion programs, it has been another one of President Trump's main priorities, and we've seen it as the subject of many of these first executive orders. Early executive orders have dealt with ending all DEI initiatives in the federal government, and it's bled a lot into the private sector. So entities that are receiving federal funding are obviously reviewing and kind of figuring out how these EOs actually affect them. Next, for healthcare. So immigration policy, economic policy, trade policy have really taken a lot of the oxygen in the room in DC. Like, there's no doubt about it. So healthcare has taken, I would say, a little bit of a backseat in these first 100 days. However, the rally cry that President Trump has been stating, and John got into this in his portion because it's definitely affected operations on Capitol Hill, is that he plans to protect Medicare and Social Security. It has been kind of his campaign slogan, and he's continuing to reiterate that through interviews, and it just remains a key talking point for President Trump. And, you know, again, John covered this, but I think thanks to a lot of recent polling, especially some polling that has done by President Trump's actual pollsters, he has added Medicaid into that protection talking points, where he said, I'm not going to support any cuts to Medicare, Social Security, or Medicaid. So we're going to see how that plays out. And obviously the budget reconciliation product will be affected by President Trump's promises here. We've actually, in the last month or so, we've seen a little bit more healthcare activity in the executive order space. And this is in terms of healthcare price transparency, which that executive order didn't really say a lot, other than it just reiterates the 2020 price transparency rules of the initial Trump administration. There's also a recent one on drug pricing, which stated some of President Trump and his administration's priorities surrounding drug pricing, which is like, increasing competition. There was a few 340B measures and just some other initiatives there. So we're starting to see the activity in healthcare ramp up just a little bit. For HHS, basically everything is being driven through the lens of the Make America Healthy Again initiative. And obviously with HHS being led by RFK Jr., who is the spokesman for the Make America Healthy Again initiative, we are not surprised that all of the agency action is essentially being rooted around the MAHA movement. For example, instead of, like past administrations have always talked about, healthcare prices are out of control and, need to be contained. This administration is focusing a lot on, okay, we need to tackle chronic condition, which is bringing up healthcare costs, and let's get to the root of these problems. So that's kind of what we've seen so far with this administration. And to continue setting the stage to inform the administration's regulatory agenda, here are just a few more things at a macro level that I thought would be helpful to cover. And I give John a lot of grief because he uses sayings all the time, and thanks to this audience for letting him use his Texas roots to add a little twist to some of those sayings. but there is a saying here that I think is really appropriate for what how DC is being informed in the regulatory space, and that is an old adage constantly used in DC, and that is personnel is policy. So essentially it is kind of self-explanatory, but it means whoever is in these key positions is going to dictate what policy happens. So that is why it is everyone's favorite parlor game. We are like obsessed with who is in these positions and kind of what they stand for and what they've done. We will say, especially in the healthcare space, this administration is absolutely stacked with people who are longtime healthcare policy players in DC, from chiefs of staffs and deputies and everywhere. It's been a lot of folks that have been around the town a long time. So it's made the parlor game of kind of guessing where they stand a little bit easier. And given that we know personnel is policy, there is one person I kind of wanted to spend a little time talking about as someone to watch, and that is Theo Merkel. And Theo Merkel is the special assistant to the president, focusing primarily on health policy. And John has scooped me a little bit, but Theo Merkel actually came from Paragon Health Institute. And if you aren't familiar with Paragon Health Institute, this is a think tank that was started by previous Trump administration officials who influence policy at both the state house and a federal level. And one example of policies that they're consistently championing is obviously site neutral payment reform. That's one that we're constantly hearing them talk about at both the state and federal level. And I think it's fair to say that most of their policies championed by Paragon aren't the most friendly to hospitals. So it's one that we're always watching. And we tell our clients that if they want a jump scare, they can of what the administration might do, just go check out Paragon's website just to read a few of their initiatives. And I guess a fun fact, if you want to call it that, we recently counted that Paragon Health Institute was named 22 times in the recently released ACA Marketplace Integrity Rule. So it's fair to say that if you're kind of wanting a window into personnel as policy and what this administration might do, this is where we might see some influence. Also, quickly, just to not necessarily have to compare Trump 1.0 to Trump 2.0, one thing that's been a very noticeable difference this time around is that we're playing from a completely new playbook. I don't think anyone can really come in and say, oh, we know what's going to happen because of the first Trump administration. It feels different. It is different. And that's, I think, a lot to do with the fact that on the first go around, the Trump administration kind of surrounded himself with outsiders, and people were not swampy and came in from the outside. But this time around, he has a lot of politicos in his operation, and that is being led by his chief of staff, Susie Wiles, who is just she's known as being an absolute pro and being credited for keeping the trains on the track. And I think probably why this administration has gotten so much done in its first 100 days. So especially in healthcare, these staffing cuts and the reorganizations that are going on are creating a new normal on how agencies work. Folks like John and I that are used to dealing with agencies are already feeling a difference, even within these first few months of just kind of how operations are changing. Focusing on HHS, roughly 25% of HHS's workforce has been shrunk. So this happened through 10,000 layoffs, and this is also on top of 10,000 who had already left HHS for like early retirement or other buyout deals. In the HHS stratosphere, FDA absolutely got hit the hardest. But another place that I think has really hit kind of the whole operation a lot too has been that a lot of communication staffers, as well as legislative and external affairs staffers, were let go from the HHS operations. So it's been interesting that congressional staff who are used to obviously working with these folks still don't kind of know who to go to. So they're relying on outside stakeholders, and seems like information's flowing just a little bit slower than what we're used to, just given that no one is in the roles that are normally communicating between the two. On the topic of reorganization, wanted to call out the new agency structure, as HHS itself, other than the staff cuts, went through a massive reorganization with the creation of what they are calling the Administration for a Healthy America. And this has kind of wrapped a few of the agents or sub-agencies as we know it into one, like the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Health, HRSA, SAMHSA, the ones that you can see here. We are expecting the current HRSA administrator and acting administrator, Tom Angles, to be the leader of this new agency. Also, since I know many of you follow and work into the 340B sphere, another thing we're kind of following that's working in conjunction with this reorganization is that the 340B program is likely moving under the CMS jurisdiction. One of our colleagues recently met with high-ranking HRSA officials, and they said that all signs point to CMS taking over 340B. Apparently, nobody really wants 340B, but they've admitted that it has outgrown the HRSA purview. So it will likely be moved under CMS and Medicaid there. For the sake of time, I don't want to spend a ton of time on this, but I would be remiss not to briefly mention it because this leaked draft HHS budget caused such a stir in the media in the last 2 weeks that I just wanted to briefly mention it. It created a lot of headlines, especially because it called for kind of draconian cuts all across the HHS universe. What does this mean? What is this budget? And essentially, every year the administration puts out a president's budget, which requests funding from Congress for the following fiscal year. And traditionally, it's just an opportunity for the administration to tout its priorities and what's important to them. And it's really largely a symbolic document. It doesn't really have any teeth because it's a request to Congress for, what the administration wants done. This is also not even the final product. It was actually, I think, what someone described as step 2 of 5 in the process, because this leaked document was where the White House went back to HHS with some suggested funding levels. And again, it was mostly a symbolic document that Congress has to act to carry out a lot of these priorities. But it did cause so many headlines, so much stir and panic that these things were actually going to happen. And, major programs were going to be cut and funding was going to be absolutely slashed. So I just wanted to point out that, this is largely a symbolic document that Congress has to enact a lot of the priorities that are stated in there. And it also isn't the final one. We expect that full final budget to be released probably next month, if it's kind of following the same schedule. All right, so deregulation in healthcare. This would, if we're talking about administration's priorities, I think this one has to be mentioned because it is a cornerstone of this administration's policy. I think it's informing a lot of what they are doing. In fact, I went yesterday to one of Dr. Oz's first official events as CMS administrator. It was at the U.S. Chamber. I must say, as a side note, that you can tell that man is a talk show host because he is smooth as silk and he he totally owned the room, I must say. But one of the only policy provisions that he really got into was this whole idea of deregulation. And I thought it was interesting that he was basically talking about how providers have lost their mojo. And he believes that providers have lost their mojo in the healthcare system because they're strapped down with all of these regulations and they have to spend more time on paperwork than patients. And he really did spend quite a bit of his small amount of time talking about how important deregulation was to get providers, and I quote, mojo back. And we can see that, the administration feels the same way because they're obviously already seeking stakeholder feedback. There is the opportunity from the White House OMB office to, call for stakeholder feedback on deregulation opportunities. Also, in all of the recently introduced rules from CMS, they contained this wide-ranging RFI asking for all stakeholders to show that where regulations can be reduced and how they can help kind of deregulate and make the system easier for all healthcare stakeholders. So they really are, from everyone that we've heard, they really are hoping for like robust stakeholder feedback, and they do plan to lean into a lot of like outside expert views. So I would strongly encourage anyone on this call, if you have some deregulatory ideas, to just definitely submit comments, even if it's a small one. I know they are paying attention to those. Lastly, I just wanted to kind of mention just the overall push of deregulation outside of just, these singular RFIs. But one that I think is really impactful, just to kind of show where they are, is that the Trump administration has claimed that their major priority is unleashing prosperity through deregulation. And one thing that they've released that we think will have a major effect on just, regulate the regulatory landscape in general is what's called the 10-for-1 rule. And what this means is basically whenever an agency makes a new rule, they have to repeal at least 10. And also the sum of cost of all new regulations for this year, including repealed ones, has to be significantly less than 0. So again, they're really trying to practice what they preach, to have a deregulatory environment. In case anyone isn't sleeping already and needs a quick little nap here, I thought I'd put this boring slide up on all of the regulations that are currently under review before they were released. We obviously expect some of these annual payment rules that are always there, to be released in the upcoming month. So no surprise there, but I wanted to kick it to John briefly to talk about this top Medicaid rule here, the preserving Medicaid funding for vulnerable populations, just because that one was a little bit of a surprise. So John, if you could briefly talk about that, that'd be great.
Back to Paragon again. This is one where CMS sent a letter to states not too long ago saying that they are taking issue with Medicaid dollars that are being spent on things that Medicaid dollars are not supposed to be spent on. They gave some examples of things like rural broadband. And so when we saw this, we thought initially that this might be tied to that CMS letter. But we also think it's tied to the provider tax issue, because in California, for example, I mentioned it earlier, California's got Medi-Cal, and they got a waiver from CMS, to provider taxes in Medi-Cal. And then they got another waiver in December from the Biden administration to allow them to increase that. And when the Biden administration did that in December, they were very clear to Californians saying that, look, we're going to do this anyway, but this really does not fit within the realm of what's possible. So we'll do it for now, but expect some rulemaking on this in the future. So how far into provider taxes this is going to go, nobody knows. But we do think that's where this is headed, is to provider taxes.
Thank you, John. And lastly, just a few takeaways of what to expect from this administration, specifically HHS. And I've talked about most of these, but obviously we expect broad healthcare reforms to happen. And there's also, we expect it to be a big push for Medicare Advantage. That's just one thing that it's a note. Dr. Oz has been very outspoken about his love for Medicare Advantage. So I think with that comes a heightened need for reforms on items like prior authorization. And I think we'll see that. And there's an appetite in Congress to do things like that, especially as the Medicare Advantage population increases. Again, focus on combating fraud, waste, and abuse in programs like Medicaid. In my Dr. Oz moment yesterday, one time he did also talk about how they're really trying to focus on what states are doing that they think is fraudulent and wasteful in Medicaid, like, having duplicate patients on the rolls and just some kind of bad actors in that realm. But I know we are watching this as making sure that, tackling fraud, waste, and abuse in Medicaid isn't just a way to cast a wide net on reform. So that's just something we're watching. Again, private sector engagement and yearning for new innovation. I do think they're really susceptible for feedback and hoping to kind of work with the industry and kind of have some market-driven ideas that will be thrown in there. So I do encourage engagement on your end as operators. And then Lastly, one thing I didn't put on there, but I think AI is another one that we can watch, and is one that we expect a lot of talking points to come out of the administration. So with that, I will leave 5 minutes for some questions and pass it back to you, Steve.
Yeah, thanks so much. Great job. If you have questions, you can put them in the chat or the question. I did put this one in, Abby. What do you think, your best guess, looking in the crystal ball, what deregulatory type items is the administration going to push? And I just asked this, does that Chevron case come into play here, or do they have to change some of these regulations through the court system?
Yeah, no, I think Chevron is going to greatly inform, the regulatory landscape, as we've kind of already seen it happen. And really a lot of this, the deregulatory push has been surrounding the patients over paperwork, and just kind of taking away some of the just burdensome, time consuming regulations that especially providers are strapped with. I don't know if you have any, John, hop in.
Maybe it's wishful thinking on my part because I alluded to Stark earlier. One of the people that's gone back to CMS, who's worked at CMS on numerous occasions, is a woman by the name of Kim Brandt. We worked with Kim a lot when she was at the Senate Finance Committee. She was at CMS during Bush. She was there during Trump 1.0. And we worked with her a lot. SEMA Verma's from Indiana. Hall Renter is headquartered in Indiana. A lot of us have known SEMA for a long time, and we were able to really push and work with her on that Stark reg that got approved right there at the end of Trump 1.0. And so, given how we know Kim feels about Stark, which is not great, we're hoping we might see some more stuff on Stark.
Got it. Let me ask you this, and you hadn't talked about it today, but I've heard, do you think that the administration is going to move to lift the moratorium on physician-owned hospitals?
I tell you, we get that one a lot. That was part of the Affordable Care Act. So, that's something that Congress is going to have to address. And, going back to Texas ties, Kevin Brady was chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee in 1.0, and Republicans had control of the House, the Senate, and the White House. And Kevin Brady was someone who was, as I'm sure many of you from Dallas know, Kevin was all about lifting that moratorium, and it never got done in 1.0. And so if Kevin Brady couldn't get that done during 1.0, I'm a little hard pressed to see how they're going to be able to get it done in 2.0.
So another question I have, in the discussions you have on Capitol Hill and you meet with people, has anybody said anything about helping address the healthcare workforce shortages?
Yeah, that's a big one for Brett Guthrie. Guthrie, he was the health subcommittee chairman of Energy and Commerce before he became full committee chairman earlier this year. And Brett has pushed health workforce shortage legislation on a bipartisan basis. ENC is actually a very bipartisan committee. I think it is technically the most bipartisan on Capitol Hill. And I've yet to see anything from him on that. I know that they want more nurses in the pipeline. They want to do those kind of things that help, push people, make it easier for people to get licensed and those types of things. And so I would not be surprised that once they kind of get past this budget reconciliation process, and I don't know whether it dawned on me that I may not have mentioned it during my presentation, but the communications folks at Energy and Commerce said that they are going to try to mark up their portion of this bill on May 7th, which is next week. They haven't noticed the hearing yet, so we'll see if they stick to that. But back to workforce, yeah, that is a priority for Guthrie, and so I don't think it's going to be long before we see legislation from the committee on that.
And just to add, not to make it back to the administration, but I do think too that speaking of AI, that's kind of in the terms of the workforce shortage. That's kind of some of the ways that they're thinking about how they can try to alleviate some of the workforce shortage problems is working with emerging technologies and AI.
As you went through your presentation, I took a couple of notes, and it really concerns me that, Texas never expanded Medicaid. So we have to do other things. And you touched on provider taxes, but I hadn't really put it in perspective until you mentioned it with the promise President Trump made he wasn't going to cut benefits. Site neutral provider taxes, eligibility and redeterminations, and removing enhanced premium tax credits would severely hurt Texas.
Well, yeah, I heard about every state. I mean, the provider tax thing, right? I mean, Indiana has the Healthy Indiana program, for example, which was a program was put in place in a deal between then Governor Mike Pence and President Obama. And, I remember people at CMS were really mad because they said, this is not expansion. This is health savings accounts using Medicaid dollars. It's but they cut the deal anyway. And yeah, I mean, Indiana just they finished their session of the General Assembly last week, and they're about to ask the federal government for more provider taxes. And that's a super majority Republican state. And so yeah, I don't know. I mean, they're going to be in a world of trouble if they start messing with provider taxes. Red states, to your point.
Right. Another quick question. I know we didn't expand Medicaid, but many states did. In fact, there's only a handful that didn't. Do you think that 90% match on the part where you expand Medicaid could get reduced? I know some states have triggers that would be impacted, or is that something that you don't think would happen?
I mean, that's the FMAP thing, right? I mean, that's part of what I talked a little bit about, in this idea that this talking point that Guthrie keeps repeating about, why does a healthy, able-bodied adult get more than a poor disabled kid? So it's certainly part of the discussion. When Abby was talking, of course, I'm slamming Twitter X, but I live on the thing, and I jumped on there, and apparently Johnson said not too long ago today that they may not get to $500 billion in Medicaid savings. That is their aspiration, is to get to $800 billion, but they may not get to $500 billion. So he's walking this back, and so this may come in, and I think I alluded to a little bit. The way this works is if they don't hit this 880 billion, but they do hit, say, 500 billion, then that's just 380 billion less that Ways and Means gets to spend on tax cuts or something else that they want to do. So it's part of the discussion, but we'll see if they really do it.
That's a good excuse not to pay attention to my portion, to do your Twitter. That was a good piece of intel.
This is the final question I have, because I know we're running over a little bit. There are a lot of providers that are on this webinar, and I don't think there's any reputable, ethical provider that doesn't agree we need to get bad actors out of Medicaid and Medicare. And if there's fraud, we should prosecute them, no question about it. But how do you advise providers to convey to legislators, yes, there may be some fraud and abuse in Medicaid, but it's not 90% of it, the way you kind of say you're going to go in and do all these cuts to eliminate fraud. How do they determine or define fraud, waste, and abuse?
It's interesting. So there's a story I'll tell you real quick. And Abby, it's your story. You want to tell the Houchin, Dr. Fish story?
No, go ahead. You got it.
So, so Erin Houchin is a congresswoman from Indiana who sits on the Energy and Commerce Committee. She sits on the health subcommittee at Energy and Commerce. So she is on the front lines of this whole debate. She has a healthcare roundtable made up of providers from all over the spectrum in Indiana, doctors, hospitals, CCBHCs, all different people from all different kinds of spaces. And so at the last roundtable, she kept using the word scheme when she talked about Medicaid. And the physician who sits on it, who is the CEO of a hospital in Southern Indiana and her district, who is also a longtime personal friend of hers and a very soft-spoken gentleman, finally, apparently, during the discussion, said, "It's not a scheme. It's a system. And it's a system in which we all participate, and one that was created by Congress." And so, yeah, I think you do have to push back on it, and you do have to talk about, what it means. And yeah, you could try to frame abuse however you want to, and waste and whatnot. But the other thing that we always say in our conversations is, and I use Indiana because we represent the Indiana Hospital Association in Washington, but Medicaid pays 57 cents on a dollar for care in the state of Indiana. What on earth do you expect these folks to do if you're going to reduce that even further?
Right.
And the dirty little secret, and I'll finish with this because Abby knows I'm on the verge of going off on a rant, is, you talk about not-for-profit hospital status. And there's always debate, not strenuous, but it comes up. Chuck Grassley's talked about for years, senator from Iowa, about getting rid of not-for-profit status for hospitals. And I think a lot of the CEOs on this webinar might admit that they might sleep a little bit better at night if they didn't have not-for-profit status, if they didn't have to worry about how they were going to keep the burn unit open and do mental health and all these other things that they lose money on every single year. And, I've said to Bill Cassidy's staff, if you want to look at how this is going to play out, if you keep going down this road, just look at your own home state and of Louisiana and what happened with HCA. They just got up and left. Everything, lock, stock, and barrel, and they moved out. And so y'all keep doing this. Y'all keep going down this road. And you don't, you think we're crying wolf, but we may reach a point where you're really not going to like the consequences of your actions. So that's my rant for the presentation.
Well, maybe we'll do a follow-up webinar, but we've kind of run out of time. But John and Abby, we can't thank you enough. Very enlightening discussion. Really appreciate the inside baseball, so to speak, because of y'all's close connections in Washington. And may run into you next week at the American Hospital Association annual meeting. But thank you so much. And to the people on the webinar, thank you for joining us, and everyone have a nice day.
Thank you so much.